In-depth background. Understanding the geopolitical conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East and their impact on global energy and economic stability. The world is witnessing significant geopolitical conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, both of which have deep roots in history and complex socio-political dynamics. These conflicts, particularly in Ukraine and ongoing tensions in the Middle East, have caused widespread concern over their potential long-term impacts on global energy prices, food security, and economic stability. To understand the full context behind these issues, it is essential to explore the root causes, how they started, and their probable consequences in the months ahead. The root cause of conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The conflict in Eastern Europe, particularly Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has roots in post-Cold War geopolitics. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's independence marked a shift in regional power dynamics. Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, has consistently aimed to reassert its influence in former Soviet territories. Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO and the EU threatened Russia's strategic position, leading to escalating tensions over the years. The 2014 annexation of Crimea and the ongoing war in the Donbass region were precursors to the full-scale invasion in 2022. In the Middle East, tensions primarily stem from a long history of sectarian divides, geopolitical rivalries, and resource control. Countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia have been embroiled in proxy wars, vying for regional dominance. The Syrian civil war, the Yemen conflict, and the instability in Iraq have made the region a hotbed of unrest. The global significance of the Middle East, particularly due to its vast oil reserves, has heightened international concerns about the long-term impacts of these conflicts. Key factors behind the conflict's energy politics. Both Eastern Europe and the Middle East are pivotal to the global energy market. Russia is one of the largest exporters of natural gas, especially to Europe, while the Middle East accounts for a significant portion of the world's oil supply. Disruptions in either region have the potential to send shockwaves through the global energy market. Geopolitical alliances and rivalries. The conflicts are deeply intertwined with global power plays. NATO's expansion, Western sanctions on Russia, and alliances between countries like Iran, China, and Russia have added layers of complexity to the situation. In the Middle East, the Sunni-Shia divide, coupled with the influence of external powers like the US and Russia, exacerbates regional tensions. Economic instability and sanctions. The imposition of sanctions, particularly on Russia, has further strained global supply chains and energy markets. These sanctions, while designed to weaken Russia's war efforts, have also had unintended consequences on global trade and energy supplies. How are the ongoing conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East likely to affect global energy prices in the next 6 months? The ongoing conflicts are expected to have a significant impact on global energy prices. With Russia controlling a significant portion of Europe's natural gas supply, any disruptions caused by the conflict can lead to a surge in energy prices. The Middle East, a key supplier of oil, is also experiencing disruptions due to rising tensions in countries like Yemen, Iran, and Iraq. Over the next 6 months, energy prices are likely to remain volatile, with potential spikes if tensions escalate further. Analysts predict that the global energy market could experience a shortfall, forcing countries to seek alternative energy sources or pay a premium for stable supplies. What are the potential economic consequences if oil prices spike due to escalating tensions in the Middle East? A spike in oil prices due to Middle East tensions could have far-reaching economic consequences. High oil prices increase production and transportation costs, which in turn leads to higher consumer prices for goods and services. Inflationary pressures would mount globally, especially in oil-dependent economies. Countries already grappling with high inflation, such as in parts of Europe and Latin America, could face economic slowdowns or recessions as businesses struggle to manage rising costs. Governments may need to intervene through subsidies or strategic oil reserves, but these measures can only provide temporary relief. With food supplies being disrupted by geopolitical conflicts, how are global food security and agricultural trade being impacted? Geopolitical conflicts, particularly in Eastern Europe, have disrupted key agricultural exports. Ukraine and Russia are both major global suppliers of wheat and other grains. The war has damaged farmland, halted exports, and raised concerns about future harvests. The Middle East conflicts also disrupt agricultural trade routes, further exacerbating global food security concerns. As a result, food prices have surged, and many nations are facing supply shortages. Developing countries, especially in Africa and the Middle East, are at the greatest risk, as they rely heavily on imported food supplies. Are there any global efforts being made to stabilize energy supplies amidst the conflict in the Middle East? Yes, several global efforts are underway to stabilize energy supplies. The International Energy Agency, IEA, has called for member countries to release strategic reserves to buffer against supply shocks. Additionally, the US and European countries are seeking to diversify their energy imports, negotiating with other oil-producing nations like Venezuela and the Gulf states. However, these efforts may take time to materialize, and the market remains highly volatile in the interim. How might the conflict in Eastern Europe influence inflation rates worldwide? The conflict in Eastern Europe has already contributed to rising inflation rates globally. As energy prices rise, transportation and production costs increase, causing inflation to ripple across economies. Central banks, including the Federal Reserve in the US and the European Central Bank, are raising interest rates to combat inflation, but this also risks slowing economic growth. The inflationary pressures are likely to persist as long as the conflict remains unresolved and energy supplies remain constrained. What role does the international community, including organizations like the UN and NATO, play in mitigating the economic fallout from these geopolitical tensions? The international community, particularly organizations like the UN and NATO, plays a crucial role in mediating conflicts and imposing sanctions on aggressor nations. NATO has provided military and logistical support to Ukraine, while the UN has been involved in humanitarian efforts to address the fallout of the conflicts. However, these organizations have limited capacity to mitigate the broader economic fallout, such as inflation and supply chain disruptions. Diplomatic efforts continue, but achieving a peaceful resolution remains challenging. In what ways could geopolitical conflicts exacerbate supply chain issues globally, especially for essential goods like food and fuel? Geopolitical conflicts, particularly in regions that are key exporters of essential goods like food and fuel, can lead to severe supply chain disruptions. In the case of Eastern Europe, the conflict has disrupted the export of grains and fertilizers, while in the Middle East, oil supply chains are vulnerable to attacks and blockades. These disruptions lead to delays, shortages, and increased transportation costs, exacerbating the global supply chain crisis that began during the COVID-19 pandemic. How are countries that are dependent on energy imports from conflict regions adapting to the uncertainty in supply? Countries that are heavily dependent on energy imports from conflict regions are exploring alternatives to adapt to the uncertainty. Europe, for instance, is accelerating its transition to renewable energy sources and seeking to diversify its natural gas imports by negotiating with Norway, Algeria, and the US. Some countries are also investing in LNG, liquefied natural gas, infrastructure to reduce dependence on pipeline gas from Russia. However, these transitions are costly and time-consuming, and many nations will remain vulnerable to supply shocks in the near term. What strategies can governments employ to shield their economies from the inflationary pressures caused by disruptions in the global energy market? Governments can employ several strategies to shield their economies from inflationary pressures. These include releasing strategic oil reserves to stabilize supply, subsidizing energy costs for consumers, and investing in alternative energy sources to reduce dependence on volatile regions. Additionally, central banks can adjust interest rates to manage inflation, although this approach risks slowing economic growth. Governments may also need to implement targeted social programs to support vulnerable populations who are most affected by rising energy and food prices. Conclusion and future outlook. The ongoing conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East present significant challenges to global energy markets, food security, and economic stability. While governments and international organizations are taking steps to mitigate the impacts, the situation remains fluid and uncertain. The global community must continue to focus on diplomatic solutions, economic diversification, and sustainable energy transitions to navigate these complex challenges. Like this video for more in-depth geopolitical analysis. Subscribe for weekly insights into global economic trends. Comment below on how your country is preparing for these challenges.